Hi guys, today I want to tell you the story of the rise and fall of my favourite band in the entire world, Cream. Our story begins with a young Peter Baker, better known on the London scene as Ginger Baker, who was becoming established as a gigging jazz drummer of some reputation. He was also a heroin and cocaine addict, both using and selling drugs regularly. In his autobiography, Ginger tells many stories that give a fairly accurate insight into his personality. Take this story, for example. Of his early days in the club scene, Ginger says, "I was continually high and completely unaware that a huge change in my personality had come about. I knew that I was playing amazing drums, but the gigs started to decrease. The manager of a club came up to me one night and told me in no uncertain terms that he didn't want me nodding off in his club. A huge row then developed in which the manager accused me of selling smack in the club, and we very nearly came to blows. As a result of this, I lost a prestigious gig, which should have been a devastating blow. This ain't the only fucking club in the world," I sneered at him as I stormed out. Despite his reputation for wildness, drugs and violence, Ginger Baker never had a problem finding another gig, no matter how many times he was fired or quit in acrimonious circumstances. Now this is an incomplete list, but before Cream, here is just some of the bands that Ginger Baker played with. The Storyville Jazzmen, the Terry Lightfoot Jazzmen, which he quit after an onstage row with the bandleader, the Diz Disley Band, which he quit after a brawl with the bandleader, the Danny LaRue Band, in which he got booed off stage, the Ken Oldham Big Band, which he quit after threatening an audience member with a pair of pliers, the Johnny Dankworth Orchestra, from which he was fired after 3 days for being a junkie. Almost all of the bands on the London jazz and blues scene had these silly, formal, slightly overblown names like, the Nigel Barraclough Compendium or something like that. Ginger also played for the Les Douglas Orchestra, the Johnny Scott Band, the Stu Hammer Quartet, the Burt Courtley Sextet, the Johnny Birch Octet, Alex Corner's Blues Incorporated, a very early version of the Rolling Stones, and the Graham Bond Organisation. So there can be little doubt that despite his extremely threatening reputation, Ginger Baker was at this time quite easily one of the most well-known and in-demand jazz drummers in the country. Ginger Baker was a Londoner, and while he was making a name for himself in England's capital city, up north in Scotland, his future musical partner and constant nemesis was doing the same in Glasgow. Young Glaswegian bass player Jack Bruce was at this time honing his skills and waiting for his first musical break. Despite the many opportunities to play in and around Glasgow, Jack knew he needed to broaden his horizons and find his way to London. In the autumn of 1961, an advert in Melody Maker for a vacancy in a big band caught his eye. The advert would require him to move to Coventry. This audition was for the Murray Campbell Big Band. Jack auditioned, was successful, and went on tour in Italy. He then worked for a while in a band in France playing jazz at an American airbase, but his time there came to an end following a burn injury. His own fault apparently, caused by trying to refill a cigarette lighter while heavily drunk and accidentally setting his arm on fire. He was 18 at the time. After being invalided home, Jack recovered and joined a band called the Scottsville Jazzmen, who toured all over the UK. And in June of that same year, 1962, the paths of the two most notorious band members of Cream crossed for the very first time. One of Ginger's many bands was headlining a ball, and Jack's band were also on the bill. Ginger says, "The set in the Jazz Marquee was really cooking when we became aware of a scruffy young man standing right beside the stage. 'Let's have a play,' he demanded, in a Scottish accent." Another member of the Burt Courtley Sextet, Dick Hextall Smith, picks up the story. "There are all sorts of possible responses when a total stranger asks for a sit-in. If you're a complete nutter, you can of course say yes, no matter what, and end up collapsing under a plague of loonies who don't know they can't play. Or you can always say no, but it's a bit unadventurous. The standard approach is to make it difficult, but not impossible, for the person who wants to sit in." That night it went at an absolutely fiendish tempo. I counted it in as fast as my fingers would move, It was so goddamn fast that the choruses came and went before you could blink. It must have been 8 or 9 choruses a minute, and holy shit, the little guys stormed into it like there was no tomorrow. Heads down and no prisoners from the off. It was demonic. I remember grinning at Ginger a few bars in. After that, it was straight through the roof. It was glorious. Okay, I said to the bass player next, we'll do Loverman in F. This time you play the tune. And by God, he did. Beautifully, faultlessly, vibrato, in tune, the lot. All the changes. Of course he did. He was Jack Bruce. Jack Bruce blew them all away, Ginger included. Ginger said the band was jumping. Poor old Morris looked a bit crestfallen when he returned to his bass at the end. I think he knew he'd lost his gig. Jack Bruce had arrived. And so, following this impromptu jam in Cambridge, the rhythm section of Cream was officially formed. And from that point forward, Jack, Ginger and a sax player called Rillo became quite tight and played for a hell of a lot of ensembles as a three-piece. And one of the many outfits that these three would play for was a band called Blues Incorporated. Blues Incorporated set up a Saturday night jazz club residency, and though it's not reported in Eric Clapton's autobiography, apparently it was at one of these sessions that the 3 band members of Cream were first sharing a stage, albeit separately, for the first time. According to Jack, the club opened on March the 17th, 1962, and over the coming weeks, budding blues musicians came from all over the country to sit in. Eric Clapton was one of them, a pale, sulky kid who came on stage with no guitar, sang a couple of songs and fled. And of course that brings us to far and away the most famous member of Cream, the mighty Eric Clapton. In 1962, Eric was beginning to get recognised as a talented guitarist. He joined a blues band called the Yardbirds in October 1963, and this was to be his first full-time job as a musician, and one in which he would begin to be recognised as one of the best blues guitarists in the country. In his autobiography, Clapton tells it this way: "The Yardbirds was my first experience of playing night after night. In the first 3 months we played 33 gigs, during which time the audience would go crazy, shaking their heads around manically and dancing in various outlandish ways. It was not uncommon during the most frenetic bits of playing for me to break at least one string. During the pause while I was changing my string, the frenzied audience would often break into a slow hand clap, inspiring the nickname of Slow Hand Clapton." And so, all 3 members of Cream were out and about on the London blues and jazz circuit, all 3 of them making a name for themselves on their instruments and being recognised as prodigious talents. After Blues Incorporated, Jack and Ginger set up another new band, this time with a musician by the name of Graham Bond, and so the Graham Bond organisation was born. During this time, Ginger had made a concerted effort to come off drugs, but he was already naturally a very aggressive and explosive person, and the withdrawal symptoms had left him on an extremely short fuse. And it was during this period that the first of many legendary fights between Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker occurred. The relationship between Jack and Ginger was rapidly deteriorating. The feud has passed into rock mythology, and it would periodically burst through like an active volcano for the next 4 decades. When asked if this has been hyped up a bit over the years, Jack's answer is emphatically no. They were both incendiary characters. Ginger's short fuse was well established, while Jack could explode under provocation. They were cooped up together almost 24/7, travelling huge distances in vans held together with hope and string. Things really must have been building up for a while, because they came to a head at a gig in Golders Green. Jack and Ginger tell 2 halves of the same story here. One specific bone of contention was Ginger's belief that Jack's bass lines were too busy. "I was playing a solo," Jack said, "but Ginger was playing all over it. So I just looked at him and he threw a drumstick at me. So I threw my bass and demolished the whole drum kit." Ginger picks up the story, but he says that Jack did more than just give him an angry look. "I'd been drinking a mixture of rum and Guinness in order to help with my withdrawal. All of a sudden Jack turned round and shouted, 'You're playing too fucking loud, man,' in the middle of my drum solo. At the end, as everyone was going out, I said, 'I'm going for a piss, Jack. Don't be here when I come back.' But when I came back, there he was, still on the stage. I rushed up, grabbed him and said I told you not to be here, and threw him off the stage. Then the silly bastard got back onto the stage and I just lost it. I went into a red haze intent on killing him. I gave Jack a right-hander, knocking him on the ground. Jack picks things up. We were rolling around on the stage, and that's when I realised that I'm not really a fighter. I felt very silly about the whole thing, not least because the whole crowd was singing "He loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah." And so, unsurprisingly, after beating Jack up on stage in front of the audience, Ginger was given a pretty serious talking to by the rest of the band. While they apparently agreed that Jack had been out of order, they made Ginger promise to never ever physically assault Jack ever again. Ginger had a young child at this time and was struggling to make ends meet, so he couldn't really afford to jeopardise his job. And it seems that despite the lifelong feud between Jack and Ginger, Ginger did make that commitment and he kept it. The Graham Bond organisation released 2 albums in 1965. But by the second album, There's a Bond Between Us, things were getting more and more fraught between Jack and the rest of the band. Ginger tells it this way. The album title, There's a Bond Between Us, proved to be unfortunate because soon after its release, the bond began to unravel. We played a gig in Ipswich at which Jack's alter ego, Mr. Hyde, made an appearance. He completely lost his temper and started shouting "No, no, no" in the middle of a song. At a post-gig discussion in the dressing room, we informed Jack in a calm manner that this would just not do. Jack's response was to storm out of the dressing room and sit in the driver's seat of the band van. We loaded up while Jack sat silently, and as soon as we were all in the bus, Jack drove off at high speed with no lights on. He mounted a curb and missed a lamppost on my side by the width of a fag paper. He skidded to a halt outside Graham's place, and Graham motioned for me to get out with him. "Ginge," said Graham, his face white with anger, "he has got to go. I am not putting up with that." I got back in, and Jack continued to drive like a lunatic until he reached his flat, where he jumped out of the cab, slammed the door, and furiously stomped off. After that, I phoned Jack with the news that he had got the sack. But as Jack recalls, he said, "You can't fire me because I was one of the people who originated the band. You're not the boss." So I just kept turning up to the gigs for a while. Then he pulled a knife on me. And after the knife pulling incident, it seems Jack finally did give up on the Graham Bond organisation and moved on. But Jack was not without a band for long, because shortly afterwards he got a call from someone called John Mayall. But now let's just hit the pause button and rewind for a moment. Because before we go on to talk about the Blues Breakers, we have to pick up on the missing third strand of the story. And that is, of course, Eric Clapton. In his autobiography, Clapton says this: "By the end of 1964, after playing well over 200 gigs, the Yardbirds were getting a bigger and bigger following. At the end of December, we were invited to support the Beatles. George and I hit it off right away, and this was the start of what was to eventually become a long friendship." Eric had been playing with the Yardbirds since October 1963. But when they had seen the runaway success of the Beatles, the band had decided to switch tracks and move in a more pop-based direction. Clapton says, "The truth is, I was taking myself far too seriously and had become very critical and judgmental of anybody in music who wasn't playing just pure blues. When the Yardbirds decided to record For Your Love, it was the beginning of the end for me. I felt that we had completely sold out." Eric was eventually invited to resign from the Yardbirds because it had become clear to everyone in the band just how unhappy he really was. Bitter and disillusioned, Eric accepted the invitation and stood down. However, within weeks a phone call came from someone called John Mayall, who had his own band, the Blues Breakers. Clapton says he called and asked if I might be interested in joining his outfit. I admired him because he was then doing exactly what I always thought we could have done with the Yardbirds. I joined the Blues Breakers in April 1965. Now at this time, future Fleetwood Mac bass player John McVie was actually the bassist for the Blues Breakers. But there was a lot of tension between McVie and band leader Mayall. Mayall didn't like alcohol around when we were working, and unfortunately McVie liked to drink a lot. This would often lead to some form of confrontation, and one of them would lose it. Lovable though McVie was, there were often times when his drinking made him aggressive, and he would either be left behind or, as on one occasion when we were returning from a gig up north, actually turfed out of the van. Clapton and the Blues Breakers began relentlessly touring the country. And it was around this time that someone spray painted the words "Clapton is God" on a wall in Islington, London. Clapton's renown as possibly the best blues guitarist in the country was starting to spread. He says, "At this point people started to talk about me as if I was some kind of genius, and I heard that someone had written the slogan 'Clapton is God' on the wall of the Islington Underground station. Then it started to spring up all over London like graffiti. In truth, I felt grateful about it because it gave me status, and even better, it was the kind of status nobody could tamper with. It came from the streets." For just a few months, Eric temporarily left the Blues Breakers to tour Europe. And this brings us back up to the point at which we paused the story with Jack Bruce. Because Jack had joined the Blues Breakers while Eric had been away. And when Eric came back from Europe, the next link in the chain was forged. Jack and Eric played together for the first time. Eric says, "Returning to England in late October '65, I found that my place in the Blues Breakers had been filled by a brilliant guitarist, Peter Green, later of Fleetwood Mac. He was not happy to see me, as it meant rather a sudden end to what had obviously been a good gig for him." One change that particularly didn't surprise me was that John McVie had finally been given the boot and had been replaced by Jack Bruce. Jack's first gig with Eric was for London Airport staff on November the 6th, 1965. Jack had never heard Eric play before and was blown away by his style and technique. John Mayall actually recorded the following night's gig at the Flamingo, and parts of that can be heard on the Mayall albums Looking Back and Primal Solos. There was an instant connection between Jack and Eric. They seemed to hit it off naturally and easily. Jack played about 10 gigs with Eric, and Mayall was sometimes upstaged by Clapton and Bruce. It was a strange period as the live shows started to become looser, with Bruce and Clapton playing off each other and Mayall losing control over much of the proceedings. It almost became a mutual admiration thing between Bruce and Clapton, both of whom were on their best form, but already showing hints of things to come. Things had apparently cooled down a little between Ginger and Jack in this time as well, and Ginger recommended Jack Bruce as a bass player to Manfred Mann, who subsequently hired him. But now, Ginger and Jack had played together, Jack and Eric had played together, and the last piece of the puzzle was Eric and Ginger. In the spring of 1966, we played a big university gig. We shared the bill with the Yardbirds. We were standing outside the hall smoking some grass when a very young-looking guy happened along. He smiled at me and said, "I know you, Baker. You ain't really a hard nut at all." I liked him immediately. Shortly after this, we were doing a gig at the Flamingo when this same young fellow turned up with a guitar and asked if he could sit in. Shit, this guy could really play, and his name was Eric Clapton. Ginger Baker was also starting to flourish as a composer. Andy had his first break as a songwriter when The Who purchased one of his instrumental songs called Waltz for a Pig for the then princely sum of £1.50. By now, Ginger Baker was considered the top jazz drummer on the whole circuit. Jack was also making waves as an arranger, having made an EP on which he took the lead for the first time with Manfred Mann. It was called Instrumental Asylum, a 4-song release on which his super tight bass playing functioned as a very prominent lead instrument. The EP hit number 3 on the EP charts, and the NME described it as possibly the finest recording made by the Manfreds so far, or any other group for that matter. Jack was emerging as a major player in his field as well. The band released another one, led and directed by Jack once again, called Machines, and this time it hit number 1. And all this time, Jack and Eric stayed in touch, bonding with one another over their love of the blues. The two men grew close. Jack recalls one moment when his delight at seeing Eric overcame him, saying, "I got banned from the Blue Boar service station on the motorway. Eric walked in and I was so excited I slung a whole greasy plate of beans, pie, bacon and eggs at him. He ducked and it hit this woman in the face. I think I'm the only person to have been banned from the Blue Boar service station, with no dinner to boot. Eric says, though I was happy with the Blues Breakers, I was also beginning to get restless, nurturing somewhere inside me thoughts of being a frontman. The Blues Breakers were playing a gig in Oxford when Ginger first came to see me. I presumed he must be pretty good, as he was first choice with all the musicians I rated. So I was very flattered that he was interested in me. On Friday, May the 13th, 1966, Ginger took his new car to Oxford to sit in with the Blues Breakers. He said, I was totally unaware that Eric was already well known. All I knew was I liked his playing. I drove to a Blues Breakers gig in Oxford, and as we walked into the gig, we saw Eric sitting on the stage looking bored as hell. In the interval, I went backstage to see him, and he said, you must come and play. So I sat in for a number, and it completely exploded, and the audience were dancing and jumping about. Clapton adds, I was rather frightened of him because he was an angry looking guy with a considerable reputation. He gave the impression that he was fearless and would take anybody on. That night after the gig, he offered me a lift back to London. He had a new Rover 3000 which he drove like a maniac, and on the trip he told me he was thinking about forming a band and asked if I'd be interested in joining. I said I'd only be interested if Jack Bruce was involved. Ginger almost crashed the car. Ginger says, I thought, oh Jesus no, but I didn't say that. On reflection, I should have said no straight away, but I didn't. I hoped that he'd learned his lesson. Ginger eventually made the call. It was arranged that he would not go to Jack's place, but to neutral ground. In Jack's words, in case he tried to knife me again. But it went well, and Jack said he is the greatest rock drummer to have come out of this country without any doubt, and in fact, probably the greatest drummer there ever was in rock music. I didn't think there would be problems because this would be a new band. And so, the best guitarist in the country, the #1 drummer on the jazz circuit, and the bass playing prodigy who was already having #1 hits, officially agreed to get together for their first ever jam. The tensions between Ginger and Jack, however, had not cooled in any way whatsoever. The next step was to gather at Ginger's house in Neasden. They just set up and jammed something in D. Ominously, however, Eric recalls hearing an argument breaking out in another part of the house, with one of them telling the other, you're doing it again, suggesting that whatever had gone on in the past was unresolved. Clapton confirms this, saying, the very first time the three of us got together in March 1966, they started arguing right away. It seemed like they just naturally rubbed one another the wrong way, both being very headstrong and natural leaders. But when we started to play, it all just turned to magic. And Ginger agrees with this, saying, when the three of us got together for our first rehearsal, we played some stuff that was totally magical musically. It was so great it was unbelievable. After a few numbers we became aware that there were a whole load of kids from the Welsh Harp Reservoir standing up on the bank, dancing and enjoying the music. And that's where the name Cream came from. Eric said simply, yeah man, we're the Cream. And at this point that name was as much a statement of fact as it was a swaggering boast. The band were thrilled with their new sound, and they realised after that first jam that they all needed to basically hand in their notice at their respective bands and fully dedicate to this one. Ginger unilaterally caused this to happen much sooner than the other two had planned by going to the press without telling Eric or Jack. Clapton says, over the next few months we continued to rehearse secretly wherever and whenever we could, and we had an unspoken agreement that that was the way things should remain until we were ready to go public. After all, we were all contracted to other bands. Then Ginger let the cat out of the bag and all hell broke loose. Jack was furious about it and almost came to blows with Ginger, and I had the unenviable task of explaining myself to John Mayall, who had been like a father to me. But now the job was done and the world knew. Cream existed. They actually played their first gig at the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, but their proper launch, their official first gig, was 2 nights later at the 6th National Jazz and Blues Festival at Windsor Racecourse. And here, circumstances conspired to cause them to kind of stumble upon the jam-based gig format for which they would become so famous. Eric says, we were an unknown band topping the bill, closing the last night's session. After playing mostly in clubs, we were now performing outside to 15,000 people. It all sounded so small, especially playing after the group then known as the world's loudest rock band, The Who. The weather was abysmal, it poured with rain, and we only played 3 songs before we ran out and Ginger had to make the announcement, "Sorry, there are no more numbers." Then we just jammed and the audience went crazy. The music press went crazy as well, describing us as the first supergroup. As the band began finding its feet live, so the individual members began also finding which roles they were best suited for and where they would fit in. Just as Ginger had done all the bookings and managed much of the admin side of things in the Graham Bond organisation, so he kind of ran the business side with Cream. And just as Jack had kind of ended up taking over and becoming the dominant force in Manfred Mann, he did the same in Cream, becoming the main frontman. While Eric was mostly a student of blues songs written by other people, Jack was also a prolific songwriter. So Jack swiftly became the singer-songwriter of the band. But Ginger, managing the business side, wanted to be cut in on the songwriting credits. Ginger tried to get Eric and Jack to agree to a 3-way royalty split on songwriting, irrespective of the writer. They both said no. This would be a huge bone of contention for Ginger, as it became clear that his arch-nemesis Jack would ultimately earn the most from Cream in publishing royalties because he, with lyricist Pete Brown, wrote the lion's share of the material, starting with the first single. And that first single really was a strange choice. A song called Wrapping Paper, which sounded absolutely nothing like Cream. Ginger Baker says this: "Our first single turned out to be the worst record Cream ever made. Wrapping Paper was the most awful song and had absolutely nothing to do with what Cream were doing, but it got released. And then when it was, I was amazed to see that the songwriting was credited to Bruce and Brown, with no mention of Eric or me. There was a big row, but I had promised I would never hit Jack again. I often had to resort to drinking loads of alcohol instead in order to finish the session." With Jack now being pretty dominant in the band, his will prevailed and Wrapping Paper was released as a single. 6 days before it came out, however, the band were in the press once again because the only person to ever seriously threaten Eric Clapton as the best guitarist in the UK had just landed from across the pond. And for 1 gig only, on October the 1st, 1966, he sat in with Cream at the Central London Polytechnic. Jack says, "I was having a drink in a pub in London and this guy came up to me and said, 'I'm Jimi Hendrix and I want to sit in with your band.' Eric was fine with it. Ginger wasn't keen, but Jimmy plugged in, playing Killing Floor, and blew us all away." Eric says, "When jamming with another band for the first time, most musicians will try to hold back, but Jimmy just went for it. He played the guitar with his teeth, behind his head, lying on the floor, doing the splits, the whole business. It was amazing. I remember thinking that here was a force to be reckoned with." Jack says, "I don't think Eric was ever the same again. He adopted the Hendrix afro and was an early champion of the psychedelic finery, in which neither me or Ginger were ever too comfortable. But Jimmy was just too nice a guy to be rivals with." And so, following a few small promotional shows in the UK, the first single came out and flopped. It was a dated, corny piano ballad that didn't sound like them at all. It peaked at number 34 and then fell out of the charts. Melody Maker wrote it off, just saying, "This is too weird for us." And in the end, Jack Bruce put his hand up and said, "That was my fault." Cream needed to get their momentum back. It was time to record something that genuinely, accurately sounded like them. Fresh Cream. Jack says, in between the usual slog around the UK, the band laid down tracks for their first album. The first attempts at recording were done in an amateurish way. We just did them live. It was not recorded as well as it might have been, but it was accurately the way the band sounded. The second single, however, which came out with the album, would turn out to be a rock and roll classic, the driving and brilliant I Feel Free. Cream, as they truly sounded, had officially arrived. The single and the album were both released on the same day, December the 9th, 1966. I Feel Free went straight into the charts at number 11, staying in the charts for 12 weeks, and the album Fresh Cream hit number 6 in the album charts, and Cream was suddenly right at the top of the pop world in the UK. The critics and the audience were at last responding positively. Fans wanting to see Jack, Ginger or Eric used to pack the clubs, but now they were lining the streets. There were often as many people locked out as were already inside. Interviewed in late 1966, the managers of 2 top London clubs agreed that Cream were the top drawing band of that year. Ginger says, "It was getting ludicrous. The gigs were coming in so fast we could barely keep up with the demand." And so, from the time of the release of their first single to the release of their first album, Cream had gone from barely edging into the top 40 to becoming the UK's top drawing live act for that year. And so, the next mission was America. First, however, Cream had an internal crisis to deal with. One of the stipulations for getting the band off the ground was that Ginger would stop using heroin. He had been doing okay and stuck to the agreement, but by early December, gigs were starting to get cancelled. Ginger failed to show up for the band's second set at the Ballroom in Camberley on December the 18th, forcing Jack and Eric to play the rest of the gig as a duo. When Ginger reappeared, there was a showdown, during which Eric and Jack went through the motions of sacking him to shock him into quitting again. And this wasn't the only issue with Ginger's drug use before they went for their first gigs in America. On January the 11th, 1967, Cream mimed along to I Feel Free on Top of the Pops. When we were leaving, I asked the roadie, "Where's Ginger? I'll go back and get him." He was in the dressing room, stretched out on a bench. He was green and he was rattling. I knew immediately that he'd overdosed. We drove him to the hospital in Willesden. If Jack hadn't gone looking for Ginger and acted quickly, that could have been it. Game over. In February and March of 1967, Cream continued touring the UK, Ireland and Europe, and this bizarre short film was made during that trip. According to Jack in Composing Himself, they shot a film prancing through fields dressed as monks and generally mucking about. The film was destined to promote the I Feel Free single in the States, but was ultimately pulled for fear of offending the Bible Belt. And following this, the band finally flew to America. Having not had a hit stateside yet, they played a 5-minute, one-song set at the bottom of the bill on an unremarkable New York variety show. Very humble beginnings considering what lay just around the corner for them in that country. Because it was through this seedy and pretty unremarkable variety show that they got their first big break. Because while there, they met Ahmet, the owner of Atlantic Records, who invited them to record at Atlantic Studios on Broadway, starting work on their second album. Shortly before they returned to the UK, they agreed, they went in and they met producer Felix Pappalardi and they recorded one song. Ginger says the first thing we laid down was Lordy Mama, one of the old blues numbers that Eric had brought in. We got the track down and Felix, the producer, asked if he could write some lyrics. We agreed and the result was Strange Brew. But Jack got pissed off because in one part he was playing a minor chord and Felix's vocal was in a major key. Then Felix wanted Eric to sing the song, and again Jack wasn't happy about this. He kept turning up with new songs, and Eric and I would say, "Great, but at the moment we're working on something else." But then Jack would throw a massive tantrum and get his stuff played. Jack, of course, had a reason for pushing for more original material, and I do believe that history has shown he was right to do so. He explains his thinking, saying, "It seemed acceptable for the first album to be littered with blues covers, but Cream had to progress because Jimi Hendrix was now storming the UK singles charts and had just released a debut album full of original compositions." And so, after their first very brief session in the studio in New York, Cream returned to the UK. And Jack Bruce, along with his writing partner Pete Brown, began working on new original songs for the second album, in the hopes of being able to compete with Jimi Hendrix. After one particularly difficult night when nothing was happening, Jack started playing in a fit of desperation. Pete was looking out of the window at the time and muttered, "It's getting near dawn." And so, Sunshine of Your Love was born, with one of the most recognisable rock riffs of all time. When the song was rehearsed with the band, Eric added the turnaround in the chorus and Ginger added his signature offbeat drum groove. According to Ginger, he insisted that Eric be given a songwriting credit on that song for his contribution, and Jack agreed. However, Ginger was hoping that Eric would do the same for him, but Eric never did. Ginger was not credited, and this was an ever-growing source of contention between the drummer and the bassist. Ginger says, what I could see even at that time was that Jack Bruce and his lyric writer Pete Brown were earning more money out of Cream than Eric and I. I thought this was incredibly unfair, and I still do. To cap it all, Jack made some objectionable comment in the car one night. When we got out, I went up to the plate glass hotel door and went to kick it open. The whole thing disintegrated into 1,000 pieces. I walked straight through it and stormed up to my room, only partially aware of the stunned silence that greeted my entrance. Eric always got upset when these rows happened because he couldn't understand what was going on. Jack could be very charming, and he and Eric were close musically. The name of the album, Disraeli Gears, came from one of the band's roadies mixing up derailleur gears, which go on bikes, with the name of Benjamin Disraeli, who had been a Prime Minister in the late 1800s. And so, when all the songs were written for the second album, the band returned to New York to record them. Eric says, the recording of the other songs that made up the album Disraeli Gears took place in New York at the beginning of May, and we recorded the whole album in the space of a week. Cream's US tour started on August the 22nd with the first of an incredible 12 nights at the very best place they could be in the summer of '67, Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. Ginger says, it has to be said that our attitude was, now we're going to show these Yanks how to play. And this we promptly did, to an alarming degree. Nobody could believe it, and the crowd worship was phenomenal. Carlos Santana sat in with us one night, and he's been a friend ever since. For the San Francisco rock audience, Cream were a revelation. To hear such virtuosity from all the musicians was not unusual in jazz, but from a rock band, it was unprecedented. Not one American band came close. Eric says we were told by Bill that we could play anything we liked for as long as we liked, even if this meant playing till dawn, and this is where we started openly exploring our potential. Sunshine of Your Love was the first single off the album, and it turned out to be Atlantic's biggest selling single to date. It hit number 5 in the American charts, and so successful was Jack's effort to write something that could contend with Hendrix that This Is a Cream song Jimi Hendrix went on to cover live. And Disraeli Gears came out 6 months after Sgt. Pepper. The album was a runaway success, hitting number 4 in America and number 5 in the UK. And interestingly, the whole band seemed to have seen these gigs at the Fillmore as their musical peak, because after this brief run of shows they went back out on the road, and at this point new cracks began to show. Ginger says, despite our phenomenal success, problems continued to surface. When we were touring, things began to go very awry with the Marshall speakers. They were incredibly powerful, and both Jack and Eric had begun with 1 or 2 and then progressed to 3 or 4. This heralded the start of what I now think of as the volume period, and it was the beginning of the end for my hearing. It got incredibly painful for me, and at one time in London, Eric had something like 10 stacks and ended the show with them all feeding back. Clapton says, musically we were flying high, but Whistle Stop touring in America was also the beginning of the end for Cream, because once we started constantly working in such an intense way, it became impossible to keep the music afloat, and we began to drown. Everybody has always believed that the demise of Cream was predominantly down to the clash of our personalities. True though it may have been that Jack and Ginger were often at each other's throats, this was only a tiny part of the picture. After the success of Disraeli Gears, the band returned to Atlantic Studios to record 3 songs for their third album before heading back to the UK in October 1967. But while in their absence Jimi Hendrix had become the flavour of the day in the UK, they were now the flavour of the day in America. American audiences were clamouring for their return, and so on February the 10th, 1968, at Manchester University they played their second from last ever show in the UK during their original run as a band. But by this time, the cracks that had formed in their previous American tour were really now starting to spread. The band were becoming exhausted from their hectic touring schedule, and Eric was starting to lose his motivation, just as he had with the Yardbirds. He says, commercially speaking, we were in very good shape. We could have sold out concert halls wherever we went twice over. But as far as I was concerned, all this counted for nothing, because we had lost our direction. Our gigs had become nothing more than an excuse for us to show off as individuals, and any sense of unity we might have had when we started seemed to have gone out the window. Following their show in Manchester, in February '68 they returned to New York to resume work on Wheels of Fire. But by this time, the relationship between Jack and Ginger had descended into all-out war. Bubbling away under the crust was the simmering hostility between Jack and Ginger, which was ready to burst through with volcanic force at a moment's notice. It had now metastasized into whole new areas. With Jack and Ginger, it was either smouldering hostility or shouting, with nothing else in between. Eric says, "We were suffering from an inability to get along. We would just run away from each other. We never socialised and never really shared ideas anymore. We were immature and incapable of putting aside our differences. Maybe too, a little rest now and then might have helped." Cream were phenomenally popular and in demand. At the same time, however, the band were now locked into a toxic cocktail of drugs, endless touring, deafening onstage volume at gigs, and a complete breakdown of communication and friendship within the group. What had once been artistic magic, musically speaking, had now become constant on-stage attention-seeking, competing with one another for who could solo the longest and the loudest. They had stopped serving the song and started serving themselves, seemingly Jack in particular. Ginger says, "The constant gigging meant our performances weren't always that good, though we'd get on stage to a standing ovation before we'd even played a note. It was always a terrible strain on my hearing. Jack always turned the volume up as loud as he could, and then Eric would have to turn up to hear himself, and I was sitting in the middle of all this. Eric stopped playing once and stood in front of me, and then I stopped playing, and we both just stood there with our arms folded while Jack was in front of these huge speakers playing away. He was completely unaware that for 2 choruses we'd stopped." Jack says, "The band used volume to generate excitement and to fill out their sound, but they couldn't hear each other play, while Jack had to scream above the noise and says he lost his voice every night." Ginger was caught in the middle of a sound war and a solo war on stage, but Eric, who was a much more sensitive person, was caught in the middle of the never-ending battle between Ginger and Jack. And he was clearly now reaching the point of being utterly unable to cope mentally with what they were putting him through. Cream performed in a Danish film called On a Saturday Night, miming to 2 of their songs, We're Going Wrong and World of Pain. And it was during this film shoot that Eric's will to stay in the band apparently finally broke. After a film shoot in Copenhagen, Eric was reduced to tears by the intensity of the arguments between Jack and Ginger. Eric was steeling himself to announce, once they'd had a break in England, that he had had enough of Cream. But it wasn't just Ginger and Jack who helped Eric to reach that decision. Another major factor was a concert review in Rolling Stone magazine from May the 11th, 1968, which slated Eric and his playing, when he was in fact right at the top of his game. Which just goes to show you how little music critics actually know and how time so often proves them completely wrong. Ginger says there had been an article in Rolling Stone written by the guy who would one day be Bruce Springsteen's manager. This piece had a terrible effect on Eric because up until then he had thought that it was the hippest magazine in the world. The article slated Cream, singling out Eric's long, boring, cliché-ridden guitar solos. Would Cream stand the test of time? The writer thought we wouldn't. But it wasn't just that it was a negative review. This gig review was released in the same magazine that featured an interview with Eric, which of course meant that fans of Eric and fans of the band would buy this magazine to read the interview and then would get clobbered with this gig review, in which John Landau called him a master of the blues cliché, a virtuoso performing other people's ideas. He also said, NSU is one of their own compositions and I think it's a terrible song, both melodically and lyrically. Generally the entire thing was twice as long as it should have been and was much too much in the established mode of lengthy but ultimately aimless improvising. Baker's drumming was too busy. He is extremely repetitious, not particularly creative and highly overactive. I found it terribly boring. Ultimately what we heard were 3 virtuosos romping through every trick in the book, occasionally building it into something, occasionally missing the mark altogether, but always in a one-dimensional style that made no use of dynamics, structure, or any other elements. Now Eric was already at the end of his tether when this came out, breaking down in tears in front of his bandmates. So, when one of the top music publications in the world baited his fans in with an interview and then slammed him in a gig review in the same issue, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. He apparently passed out upon reading it. This betrayal by the music press, combined with Jack and Ginger's war and the whole band's deafening stage volume, worked together to bring everything to a head. Ginger says, "I'd get into the hotel after a gig and my ears would be making terrible noises. One night I stood up from my drums and went over to Jack. 'Can you turn down a bit?' I asked. But he shouted over to Eric he asked me to turn down and made a big thing about it. After that gig, Eric came up to me and said, 'I've had enough of this.' And I said, 'I'll tell you what, so have I.' We decided then that it was to be the last tour. Jack was unaware of this because it was Eric and my decision." And so, with remarkable symmetry to how it had happened before with the Graham Bond organisation, Jack had kind of become too much for everyone to handle. The rest of the band wanted him out, and the proof that Jack seemed to be the main problem was further confirmed by the fact that Eric and Ginger remained playing together in their next musical outfit, Blind Faith. A conversation was had between the members of Cream, and they all agreed that the time had come to go their separate ways. But first they had a few commitments to fulfill, both on tour and in the studio. Eric says, "In the meantime we struck a deal agreeing to do 2 more albums, one of which we had partially recorded before leaving the States. A farewell tour of America in the autumn, and 2 last shows in London on our return." Relations within the Cream camp didn't improve, and they had to spend time at Atlantic finishing off what was originally intended to be just a studio album. When they arrived in June, Tom Dowd was shocked at how the demeanour of the band had changed. He knew that there were problems, but later remarked that there were times during playbacks when he thought they were going to kill each other. Jack wanted to go straight back home. It had got so bad that even though he knew the end was in sight, he almost didn't make the final sessions at Atlantic. A few months before Wheels of Fire came out, Cream released another non-album single, which unfortunately, once again, flopped. Anyone for Tennis charted even lower than Wrapping Paper in the UK at number 40, and didn't crack the top 40 in America whatsoever. This was an acoustic folky tune written and sung by Eric as part of a soundtrack. However, Felix, their producer, knew that their incredible live performances were what set them apart, regardless of what Rolling Stone had printed. And so he pushed for this next album to be a double, 1 disc studio recordings and the other live. And so when Wheels of Fire came out, it went straight to number 1 in America. And it became the first platinum-selling album ever of all time, supported by the single White Room. And that album was, in my opinion, the band at their absolute best, showcasing Cream at the peak of their abilities. But all the brilliance and all the success didn't really matter, because the end was now in sight. Once the Wheels of Fire sessions had finished, the band took a much longer break. It lasted until the beginning of October, when they were due to start a farewell tour of America and play some of the largest venues in the country. And during this time, Eric Clapton and George Harrison were beginning to get quite close, to the point that George Harrison actually invited Eric into the studio to record with the Beatles. Eric says, "Sometimes I would go down to George Harrison's house and we'd play our guitars and take acid." And bit by bit a friendship began to form. One day early in September, George drove me over to Abbey Road Studios where he was recording. When we arrived, he told me that they were going to record one of his songs and asked me to play guitar on it. I hadn't even brought my guitar, so I had to borrow his. The song was "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." We did just 1 take, and I thought it sounded fantastic. The next month, Cream resumed rehearsals in preparation for their final tour of America, and the goodbye tour of America passed largely without incident. At the end of it, however, Jack Bruce did go missing on a drugs binge to Mexico, only just making it to the studio in time to start recording the 3 tracks of their final album, Goodbye. Jack says the concept was simple. Each band member would compose 1 song, with the rest of the tracks to be selected from the bank of live recordings. And Eric Clapton's track on that album, Badge, was actually, essentially, a co-write between him and two Beatles. George Harrison said, "I helped Eric write Badge. We were working across from each other and I was writing the lyrics down and we came to the middle part, so I wrote Bridge. Eric read it upside down and cracked up laughing. 'What's Badge?' he said. And then, after that, Ringo walked in drunk and gave us that line about the swans living in the park." George also played rhythm guitar on the track, but for contractual reasons he could only be credited as L'Angelo Misterioso, the mysterious angel. When Goodbye was released, it went to number 1 in the UK and number 2 in America. And so, release-wise at least, Cream went out on a high. Now they just had to play their final few gigs and all their contractual obligations would be fulfilled. On November the 26th, Cream played their last 2 concerts in the UK at the Royal Albert Hall. Fans queued for tickets for 7 hours outside the venue. Tony Palmer filmed the concert for the BBC and says that the band hardly spoke to each other. There was no after-show party, Eric went off for a drink, and Jack says he doesn't even recall saying goodbye. Of this gig, Eric recalls, "Before the gig started, I just wanted to get it over with, but once I was up on stage, I thought it was great that we could do this and keep our heads held high. My overwhelming emotion, however, was that we had done the right thing. I think we all knew that." Ginger, however, had no such positive reflections on the show, saying, "I hated the Albert Hall gig. I just couldn't stand the volume, and the last year of Cream damaged my ears permanently." But this wasn't actually the final Cream show in the 60s. They said their last goodbye over 3 nights at Madison Square Gardens in America, as at the Albert Hall, nothing happened after the show. Following Cream's split, Clapton and Ginger went on to work together in a band called Blind Faith before Clapton launched his solo career. Jack launched a solo career as well, and nothing much happened in the Cream camp for decades. But the hunger for more from the supergroup never really abated. From the moment Cream left the stage at Madison Square Garden in November 1968, journalists trotted out one stock question at any opportunity: would Cream ever reform? Jack was usually warmest towards the idea and would never rule it out. Eric was more wary. Ginger dismissed any such notion out of hand and was adamant in the years directly following the breakup that he would never play with Jack again. Cream did play together again very briefly in that long hiatus, however, in 1993 when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and performed 3 songs. Following this reunion, Ginger and Jack both asked Clapton to reunite, but he turned the offer down, wanting to stay focused on his solo work. He had recently released Unplugged, the biggest record of his solo career, and at that time his attention was elsewhere. And in my opinion, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was one of the worst and tamest things they ever did anyway. Ironically, since the ending of Cream, Jack and Ginger, of all people, continued to play and fight their way in and out of multiple different bands throughout the years. However, as time progressed, Jack began to fall ill, and the thought occurred to Eric that there was not an infinite amount of time left for the band to reunite, if they were ever going to. Eric says, "For some time I had been thinking about having a reunion of Cream. It had been almost 40 years since the creation of the band, and given the fact that we were all still capable of playing together, I thought it would be fitting to pay tribute to ourselves while we still could. I was also very aware that I had always been the reluctant one on this score. So, cap in hand, I made some delicate inquiries as to whether Jack and Ginger would be interested." So, almost 40 years after they said goodbye, Eric Clapton made the call and got the band back together. They booked a run of reunion shows in the same place they had said goodbye to the UK scene, the Royal Albert Hall, which brings us to the final chapter in the Cream story, which, you won't be surprised to hear, bears a striking resemblance to the beginning. Of course, the biggest concern, first and foremost in everyone's mind, was that Jack and Ginger would get along when the band reformed. And it does seem that apart from one incident right at the beginning, Jack did manage to keep his kind of domineering and belligerent side under wraps. Ginger says, "We had 3 weeks of rehearsals at Bray Studios in Berkshire. The first time we played Spoonful, Jack didn't seem to know the arrangement. As usual, he insisted he was right. We played the old tape of Spoonful, and of course I was right, because I had actually done the original arrangement. This happened a couple of times and Eric got very annoyed. It was nearly the end of it all before it had even begun, until Jack apologised. There was just one musical disagreement between Jack and Ginger about the rhythmic phrasing of Spoonful, but Jack says Ginger was right and I quickly apologised. Clapton says, as the days went by we quickly found our pace again and started to sound really good. I was tremendously relieved, but I wasn't sure how it would go, as I knew that some of the old resentments were right there under the surface, waiting to be rekindled. The Daily Telegraph was the first to report the news of a reunion in November 2004, and the tickets for the shows sold out fast. The shows were, of course, filmed and recorded and released, and on stage Cream were clearly happy, playing well, and the audience loved it. And to cap it all, even Ginger was positive about the whole experience, saying the gigs were an absolute joy. It was fantastic, like 1966 all over again. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. We all did. Clapton agrees, saying it was a great experience and I'm really glad we did it. I'll never forget the standing ovation we got when we first walked on stage. It went on and on and on for at least 2 or 3 minutes. It was tremendously moving and made it all worthwhile. If only we'd left it there. The band also wanted to play in America as part of their reunion, but of course it was at this very final run of gigs in the States that the ugly spectre of Jack versus Ginger reared its head for the final time. Ginger says, next we took the reunion to the States and sold out 3 nights at New York's Madison Square Garden. We got on stage to do the first gig and it was immediately different to the Albert Hall. We played We're Going Wrong and all of a sudden Jack turned round and in front of the whole audience shouted, "No, you're playing it too loud." He used to do it with Graham Bond. He did it with Cream, and if London had brought back the glory days of 1966, New York transported us back to the bad old days of 1968. I felt I was being humiliated in front of 20,000 people, and it was not a pleasant experience. Jack got louder and louder as the gig went on, and it got very painful. As we came off, he said, "I wish you wouldn't do that when I'm trying to play." I replied, "I'm not talking to you, Jack." But it was all caught on film this time, and the tapes at Madison Square Garden have never been used for that very reason, I imagine. Now, I tried to track this moment down online via bootleg or anything, but I just couldn't find it. Every source I could find for that first Madison Square Garden gig has an edit that cuts off the beginning of We're Going Wrong, presumably cutting out the moment where Jack says that to Ginger. But if you have any video evidence or audio evidence of that moment, please let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to hear it. Clapton says, in that short amount of time, our mindset had gone back to the 60s, and once again we were flying high on our egos. As a result, the New York shows were a pale shadow of what we sounded like in London. For me, the heart had gone out of it, and a certain amount of animosity had crept back in. I knew enough was enough, and I would probably not be passing this way again. It was good, however, to know that both the other lads would be solvent for a while, and overall, that made it worthwhile for me. And so, the Cream story finally came to its end. Jack Bruce, who remains my favourite bass player of all time, passed away on the 25th of October 2014, aged 71. Ginger Baker joined him to continue the feud in the afterlife on the 5th of October 2019 at the age of 80. Of course, at the time of filming, Eric Clapton is still going. And I have tickets to see him for the first time in May next year, along with my dad, who was there as a teenager during the Cream years. Eric will be 79 by that time, and the last man standing of the world's first and greatest supergroup, the one and only Cream.